You had no right to still be living in that house, my son-in-law said. My own son-in-law said that. Sit with it for a second before I tell you how we got there. I'm 68 years old. I drove a truck for 34 years. Kowalski Freight Lines, if you can believe a company that small still exists, though it doesn't anymore. Not under that name. I hauled refrigerated produce mostly, sometimes machine parts, up and down I-70 between Columbus and St. Louis so many times I could tell you which rest stops had good coffee and which ones just had old coffee that tasted like the pot. My wife Eleanor and I built the house I'm about to tell you about. Not built it with a contractor and a mortgage and a ribbon cutting. Built it with our own hands over about 6 years, starting in 1991. I poured half the basement floor myself on a Saturday in July, so hot I had to stop twice to throw up in the yard. Eleanor did the wiring in the second bedroom because she'd worked at an electronics plant before we married and knew more about it than the electrician we hired for the rest of the house. There's a hallway closet with a door that still doesn't sit quite right in its frame because I hung it myself at 11 o'clock at night after Eleanor went into labor with our daughter 3 weeks early and I needed something to do with my hands while we waited for her mother to come watch the dog. That daughter is named Denise. She's 40 now. And this story isn't really about her, even though she's in almost every part of it. It's about her husband, Marcus, and it's about a house. And it's about a piece of paper that sat in a drawer at my lawyer's office for 20 years, doing absolutely nothing until the one night it mattered more than anything I've ever owned. I should tell you about Eleanor first, because you can't understand what that house means to me without understanding what she meant to me. She passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late because she was the kind of woman who'd tell you she was just tired for 8 months before she'd admit something was wrong. I drove her to every appointment in Columbus myself, even after I'd retired, and there was no reason for me to be the one behind the wheel except that I wanted to be the one behind the wheel. I remember the parking garage at the cancer center had a broken gate arm for almost a year, and every single time we drove in I'd say, "Still broken," and every single time she'd say, "Good. Saves us the ticket," and we thought that was funny every single time. That's the kind of thing you don't forget. Not the big speeches, not the last words. The broken gate arm. After she died, Denise started coming around more. I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story where everybody's a villain except me. For about 2 years, Denise called every Sunday. She'd bring over a casserole sometimes, sit with me on the porch, ask about the yard. I liked those Sundays. I looked forward to them the way you look forward to something that isn't much but is yours. Marcus came into the picture about the same time, married Denise a year after her mother died. I'll be honest with you. I didn't dislike him at first. He was polite. Bit of a talker. The kind of guy who tells you about an investment opportunity before you finished your coffee. But plenty of men are like that, and most of them are harmless. He worked in real estate, a broker, did fine for himself as far as I could tell. Drove a car that was nicer than it needed to be. I noticed that. I didn't say anything. I remember the wedding, actually, more than I remember most of the early years with Marcus. It was a small ceremony out near the reservoir, and I gave a toast I'd written on an index card because I've never trusted myself to speak off the cuff at anything important. I said something about how Eleanor would have loved seeing Denise in that dress, and I had to stop for a second in the middle of it. Marcus, I'll give him this, put his hand on my shoulder while I collected myself. I thought at the time that meant something. Maybe it did mean something once. People don't always change so much as they get squeezed by circumstances until whatever was already inside them comes out. For the first couple of years, Marcus and I got along fine. He'd ask about the truck driving days sometimes, seemed genuinely curious about the stretch of I-70 through Terre Haute where I once drove 11 hours straight because a snowstorm had shut down every truck stop between there and Columbus. He laughed at that story every time I told it, which I appreciated. Since Denise had heard it so many times, she usually just nodded along without really listening anymore. It was little things at first, the way it usually is with families. He'd correct me at dinner about something not worth correcting. The year a certain highway was built, the name of a diner that had closed. Small stuff. I let it go, the way you let things go with your daughter's husband, because making an issue out of nothing costs you more than it's worth. Here's where it starts to turn, and it turns slow, the way most bad things in families do. Nobody hands you a single moment you can point to and say, there, that's when it broke. It's more like a hairline crack in a foundation. You don't see it happen. You just notice one day that the door doesn't close right anymore. About 2 years ago, Marcus started asking me questions about the house, casual at first. You ever think about downsizing, Walter? Big place for one person. I told him I was fine. I told him I liked mowing the lawn, liked the quiet, liked being in the house I built with my own hands and my wife's wiring. He'd nod and drop it, but he kept bringing it up. Every couple of months, a little more pointed. Then he mentioned Airbnb, not about my house, at first, about a property he and a partner had bought 2 hours away, near some lake town that was supposed to be the next big short-term rental market. He talked about it at Thanksgiving that year, like it was already a success, pulling out his phone to show pictures of the dock, the fire pit he'd had installed, a hot tub he said would pay for itself in one summer. Denise looked proud of him. I remember thinking, good for him, good for them, hope it works out. I even offered to help him seal the deck that spring. I still know how to swing a hammer, whatever people assume about a man my age. And he said thanks, but he had a guy for that. I didn't push. It didn't work out, the property. I found this out slowly, the way you find out most things about your kids once they're grown and don't tell you everything anymore. Denise let it slip on the phone one Sunday. She didn't mean to, I don't think, it just came out. That the lake property had some issues. Bookings were down. The town had passed some new short-term rental ordinance that cut into the margins. There was a partner involved, someone Marcus didn't talk about much, and Denise mentioned his name once, Greg, and then caught herself and changed the subject fast enough that I noticed, even if I didn't understand why at the time. I didn't push. You learn not to push with your own children once they're adults. You wait for them to tell you what they want you to know, and mostly they don't, and you make your peace with that, because the alternative is becoming the kind of father who corners his daughter for answers she doesn't want to give. Looking back now, I think that was the season everything shifted, though nobody could have told you the exact week. Marcus started coming to fewer family dinners, and when he did come, he was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, more like a man doing arithmetic in his head that isn't coming out right. Denise started calling on Wednesdays sometimes instead of just Sundays, which should have told me something was wrong because Denise has never been a woman who calls just to check in. She calls when she needs something or when she's carrying something she doesn't know how to put down. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Marcus had a partner in that deal who was getting impatient. A man named Greg Aldous. I found out his name much later. Someone Marcus had met at some real estate conference. And Greg Aldous, from what I understand now, was the kind of investor who doesn't like hearing it's slow right now. He likes hearing we've got another property coming online. I think that's where I come in, not as a father-in-law, as a property. I don't want to make Marcus sound like a monster, because he wasn't. That's important to me, actually. I've thought about this a lot since it happened, turned it over more times than I can count, and I don't think Marcus woke up one day and decided to be cruel to an old man. I think he woke up scared. Scared of Greg Aldous. Scared of the money he'd already put in. Scared of what it would mean about him if this whole thing collapsed. And somewhere in that fear, my house. A house he'd been in maybe 30 times in 5 years, a house he'd never once helped fix a single thing in, started to look, in his mind, like a solution. 4 bedrooms, one old man living alone in it. A finished basement he probably didn't even know Eleanor wired. I don't remember exactly when the first brochure showed up. I want to say it was a Tuesday, because Denise usually called on Sundays, and this felt like it broke the pattern, but I've told this story enough times now that the days have started to blur on me. What I remember clearly, the thing that stayed sharp when everything around it has gone soft, is the color of the folder, blue, with a picture of an elderly couple laughing on a porch that looked nothing like mine, holding hands, wearing sweaters that looked new. Willowbrook Senior Residences, it said. Denise handed it to me at the kitchen table like it was a gift. "We just want you to look at it, Dad," she said. "That's all, just look." I looked. I said it was nice. I meant the folder was nice. The paper stock, the photography, the layout. The way you'd say a magazine advertisement was nice without meaning you wanted to buy the car in it. I didn't mean anything else by it, but I think they heard what they wanted to hear because after that, things moved fast. Denise brought it up twice more over the following weeks, each time a little more directly. Once she mentioned a woman from her book club whose father had made the move to a place like Willowbrook and how much happier everyone in that family seemed now that the burden was off their plate. She used that word, burden, and I noticed it, the way you notice a splinter before it really starts to hurt. I told her I appreciated her looking out for me, and I meant it, because I did believe at that point that this was coming from Denise and not from somewhere else. I didn't yet understand how much of it was Marcus standing just behind her, out of frame. 3 weeks later, a Saturday evening, I remember it was a Saturday because there was some rerun of a game show playing on the TV in the background the whole time, one of those shows where people guess prices. And I couldn't tell you which one it was, but I remember the sound of the audience laughing under everything that happened next. Denise and Marcus came over together. Marcus was carrying a leather folder, not the blue Willowbrook one, a different one, papers. We sat in the living room, my living room, the one with the fireplace I built the mantel for out of a beam salvaged from Eleanor's father's old barn. Marcus set the folder on the coffee table and didn't open it right away. He talked for a while about logistics and the market, and how a house like this really shouldn't be sitting underutilized. I remember that word, underutilized, like the house was a piece of equipment and I was the reason it wasn't running at full capacity. He walked me through some numbers, actually pulled up a spreadsheet on his phone at one point, turned it toward me like I'd want to review it. 4 bedrooms, he said. Finished basement. A market rate for the neighborhood he rattled off like he'd memorized it that afternoon, which I suspect he had. He said something about converting an underperforming asset into a revenue stream. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is my house he's talking about. This is the house where his wife grew up, and he's talking about it like a strip mall he's trying to lease out. I asked him at one point whether he'd run any of this by Denise before tonight. He said of course they'd discussed it at length. I looked at Denise when he said that. She didn't deny it. She also didn't confirm it with any words, just a small nod, eyes still down at her lap, the kind of nod you give when you've stopped being sure whose side you're supposed to be on in your own marriage. Then he said it. You had no right to still be living in that house. I want you to understand. He didn't yell it. That's the part that stays with me most. He said it flat, almost gentle, like a man explaining a rule I should already know, like I was the one being unreasonable. I asked him what he meant by that. He said the house was in Denise's name. Had been for 20 years, he reminded me, like I might have forgotten my own decisions, and that it was time to be realistic about what made sense financially for the family going forward. He said a man my age living alone in a 4-bedroom house was, in his words, not a sustainable use of an asset. He said this while looking at the fireplace I built. And here's the part that hurt more than anything he said. Denise sat next to him the whole time and said nothing, not a word in my defense, not a hand on my arm. She looked at her lap, mostly, and once she looked at me. Just once, and I couldn't read what was in that look. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe just exhaustion, the exhaustion of a woman who'd stopped fighting her husband about something a long time before that night and had decided this was easier. I don't remember exactly what I said back to Marcus in that moment. I remember standing up. I remember walking to the kitchen and standing at the sink for a while, running the water over my hands even though my hands weren't dirty, just because I needed to do something with them. I remember the coffee I'd made that afternoon had gone cold on the counter, and I never did get to drink it, and for some reason that's the detail that comes back to me most when I think about that night. Not the words, the cold coffee. I stood there long enough that Denise came and found me. She didn't say much, just stood in the doorway, arms crossed the way she used to stand when she was a teenager, working up the nerve to ask for something she already suspected I'd say no to. "Dad," she said, "please don't make this harder than it has to be." I didn't answer right away. I was looking at the window over the sink, the one Eleanor used to keep a row of little clay pots on. Herbs mostly, basil and something called lemon balm that I never once used in cooking but that she loved the smell of. The pots are still there. I've never moved them. "I'm not making anything hard," I finally said. "I'm just standing in my kitchen." She didn't have an answer for that. She went back to the living room, and I stood there a while longer before I followed her. When I came back into the living room, Marcus had the leather folder open, papers laid out, a form from Willowbrook, a form that looked like it had something to do with the house. I didn't read it closely that night, I'll admit that. I wasn't in a state to read anything closely. "We're not trying to hurt you, Dad," Denise finally said. Her voice was small. Marcus thinks, this is what's best." I told them I needed time. I told them I wasn't signing anything that night. Marcus's jaw tightened, just slightly, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, more like a man doing math in his head and not liking the answer. He said, "Fine, take some time," but he said it in a way that made clear he didn't think time would change the outcome. He said the papers weren't going anywhere. He said it like a threat dressed up as patience. They left around 9. I remember because the game show rerun had ended and the local news had come on, and I sat in that chair. My chair. The one I reupholstered myself after the dog chewed through the arm of it back in 2004, and I didn't move for almost an hour. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because people expect me to say I cried, and maybe that would make a better story, but I didn't. I just sat there feeling something I didn't have a good word for. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something more like the feeling you get when you realize a door you thought was locked was never locked at all. Someone could have walked through at any time, and you just never knew. I thought about calling my old friend Ferris that night. I didn't. I told myself I'd wait until morning, that decisions made at 9 at night after a shock like that are rarely good ones. That's something Eleanor used to say to me, actually. "Sleep on it, Walter. The house will still be standing tomorrow." And I suppose some habits outlive the person who taught them to you. I sat up later than I should have that night, in the chair, thinking about the year we broke ground on that house. Eleanor was 29. I was 31. We'd been saving for a down payment for almost 4 years, and even then it wasn't enough. So we bought a smaller lot than we wanted, and I told Eleanor we'd make up the difference by doing as much of the work ourselves as the county would allow. She didn't blink. She just said, "Then we'd better learn how to do a lot of things we don't know how to do yet." And that was that. We fought about that house more than we fought about almost anything else in our marriage. Not because we didn't want it, but because building something together shows you exactly where two people don't agree. I wanted a porch that wrapped around the side. She wanted the money spent on insulation instead, said a warm house mattered more than a pretty one. And she was right, though I sulked about it for a week. We compromised on a porch just across the front, nothing fancy, and I built the railings myself out of cedar that I sanded by hand on Sunday afternoons while she sat nearby reading, occasionally telling me I'd missed a spot. The hallway closet door, the one that still doesn't sit right in its frame. I've never fixed it in over 30 years. Not because I couldn't, but because I hung it the night Denise was born. Rushing, nervous, half my mind already at the hospital, and something about leaving it slightly crooked has always felt like leaving a fingerprint. Eleanor used to tease me about it. "Fix the door, Walter. I like the door the way it is." We had that exact exchange probably 200 times over the years, and it never stopped being funny to either of us, which I think is its own kind of miracle in a marriage. Finding the same small joke funny for 3 decades. I don't share all that to make you feel sorry for an old man sitting alone with his memories. I share it because I think you can't understand why that house mattered to me more than any real estate value Marcus could put on a spreadsheet. It wasn't an asset. It was a record. Every uneven board and hand-me-down cabinet in that place was a decision Eleanor and I made together, back when we were young enough to still be figuring out who we were as a couple. Marcus looked at square footage. I looked at 30 years. Now I need to back up here and tell you something I hadn't told Denise. Hadn't told anyone, really, except Eleanor. And Eleanor had been gone 6 years. 20 years ago, when Eleanor got her first diagnosis. Not the cancer that took her, a different scare years before, something with her thyroid that turned out to be manageable but terrified us both at the time. Our lawyer, a man named Ferris Whitlock, who I'd known since high school, sat us down and said something about protecting the house. Medical bills back then could wipe out a family fast if things went badly, and there were certain protections available if the primary residence wasn't held directly in the name of the person receiving care. It's complicated, and I won't pretend I understood all of it even then. What I understood was this. Ferris drew up paperwork that put the house in Denise's name. She was 18 at the time, our only child, and it made sense on paper. But he included something called a reversionary clause. I didn't fully grasp what it meant back then. Ferris explained it to me more than once, actually, because I kept forgetting the details, the way you forget the specifics of an insurance policy you hope you'll never need. What it meant, in plain terms, was this. If I was ever removed from that house against my will, if I was ever forced out of my primary residence without my informed and voluntary consent, ownership would revert back to me automatically, not through a lawsuit, not through years of fighting. Automatically, the moment certain conditions were triggered, because the original transfer had never been an unconditional gift. It had always, quietly, remained mine to reclaim. I hadn't thought about that clause in probably 15 years. It sat in a drawer in Ferris's office the whole time, the same way a fire extinguisher sits in a hallway closet. You don't think about it until the one night you need it. The next morning, I called Ferris. He's 70 now too, mostly retired, plays golf 3 days a week, and complains about his knees the other 4. He remembered the clause the second I mentioned it, before I'd even finished the sentence. "Walter," he said, "you tell me the second anyone tries to move you out of that house. I mean the second." I told him what had happened the night before. There was a long pause on the line. I remember that pause. It went on long enough that I thought the call had dropped. And then he said, "Get everyone in a room. I want to be there." It took another 2 weeks to arrange. Denise called several times during that stretch, her voice getting tighter each time, asking if I'd thought it over. I told her I had, and that I wanted to meet properly, with Ferris there, for clarity, I said, which was true, though I imagine she thought I meant clarity about moving out, not clarity about staying. Those 2 weeks were strange ones. I kept mowing the lawn, kept going to my Tuesday coffee with a few of the other retired drivers at a diner near the old terminal, kept doing all the ordinary things a man does, except now every ordinary thing felt like it was on a kind of borrowed time. I remember standing in the backyard one afternoon, looking at the fence I'd built board by board back in '97 and thinking, someone might tell me in a month that none of this is mine anymore. It's an odd feeling, grief for something you haven't lost yet. I don't know a better way to describe it than that. Ferris called me twice during that stretch just to check in, which wasn't like him. He's not a hand-holding kind of man, never has been, but I think he understood something about what those 2 weeks were doing to me. The second call, he said something I've thought about since. He said, "Walter, the paper doesn't care how scared you are right now. It's going to say what it says whether you sleep or not, so you might as well sleep." I told him that was easy for him to say. He laughed and told me he was right about most things and I should get used to it. I didn't sleep much, if I'm honest. But I did keep the coffee with the other drivers on Tuesday, and I did keep mowing the lawn. And there's something to be said for doing the ordinary things even when everything underneath them feels uncertain. Eleanor used to say that too, actually, near the end. "Keep doing the small things, Walter. They hold the rest of it together." I didn't understand what she meant until I was the one sitting in an empty house waiting to find out if it was still mine. We met on a Thursday evening at my kitchen table this time, not the living room. I made coffee, real coffee. This time I drank it, and Ferris arrived 15 minutes early with a slim folder of his own, much thinner than Marcus's leather one, but it turned out to weigh a great deal more. Ferris and I sat at the table for those 15 minutes before anyone else arrived, not saying much, just two old men drinking coffee in a kitchen that had seen better and worse nights than this one. He asked me once quietly, "You sure about this, Walter?" I told him I was sure about the house. I wasn't sure about anything else. He nodded like that was an answer he understood. Denise and Marcus arrived right on time, which didn't surprise me. Marcus has always been punctual, I'll give him that. The kind of man who shows up early to things that matter to him and treats other people's time like a resource to be managed carefully. He shook Ferris's hand, introduced himself, called him Sir, which struck me as almost funny given what was about to happen. Marcus started the conversation, same as before, talking about the practical realities and what made sense long-term. He'd brought an updated version of the same numbers from before, mentioned a specific unit at Willowbrook that had just opened up, like it was a limited-time offer. Ferris let him finish. Ferris has always had that quality. The patience of a man who already knows how the conversation ends but respects you enough to let you get there yourself. He let Marcus talk for a good 10 minutes, nodding occasionally, not writing anything down, just listening the way a man listens when he already has the answer in his coat pocket and is waiting for the right moment to take it out. I watched Denise during all of this. She had her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from, and she kept glancing at me, then at Marcus, then back down at the table, like a woman standing between two rooms and unsure which door to walk through. Then Ferris opened his folder. He took his time about it, the way he takes his time about most things, and pulled out a single document, old enough that the paper had gone slightly yellow at the edges. He set it in the middle of the table, not sliding it toward anyone in particular, just placing it there for everyone to see. He explained in plain language what the reversionary clause meant. He explained that the deed transfer 20 years earlier, the one that had put the house in Denise's name, had never been an unconditional gift. It had been drafted at the time with a specific protective condition attached, one that both Eleanor and I had signed and understood, even if the details had faded from memory over the following 2 decades. He explained that any attempt to relocate me from the property without my clear, voluntary, and informed consent would trigger that clause automatically, and a leather folder full of nursing home paperwork placed in front of an unwilling man on a Saturday evening with a partner's financial pressure sitting unspoken behind it did not, in his professional opinion, constitute informed consent by any reasonable legal standard. What that means, Ferris said, tapping the document once with 2 fingers, is that ownership of this property reverts to Walter, effective immediately, the moment a forced relocation is attempted. It's already on file. It's already been on file for 20 years. This isn't a negotiation. This is a fact that happens to have been sitting quietly in a drawer until tonight. I watched Marcus's face while Ferris talked. I've thought about that face a lot since. It wasn't rage, not right away. It was something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. The look of a man watching a plan he'd built his hopes on for months simply stop existing in real time. His jaw worked for a second like he wanted to say something and couldn't find where to start. Finally, he said something about getting his own lawyer to review it. Ferris said that was entirely his right, of course, and slid a copy of the original 2004 filing across the table, already notarized, already a matter of public record at the county recorder's office. There wasn't much left to review. Marcus picked it up anyway, read the first paragraph twice, and set it back down without saying anything for a long moment. "This doesn't make sense," he finally said, mostly to Denise. "You never mentioned this." "I didn't know," Denise said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word no. "Dad never." "I didn't know this was still in effect. I thought that was just something from when Mom was sick. I didn't know it still meant anything." I believed her. I want to say that plainly because it would have been easy for her to pretend she'd known all along and let Marcus think she'd been keeping a secret weapon in her pocket the whole time. She hadn't. She looked as surprised as he did, Maybe more surprised because she was the one who'd have to live with what her own signature all those years ago had actually protected. Denise didn't say much during any of this. I don't remember her saying anything at all, actually, until Ferris had gathered his folder and was getting ready to leave. Then she said my name, just Dad. And when I looked at her, she had tears in her eyes, and she said, "I didn't know he was going to push it like that. I told him to slow down. I should have said something that night. I'm sorry I didn't say something that night." I believe her. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to tell you this story and make Denise into someone as cold as Marcus, and that wouldn't be true. Denise is my daughter. She grew up in that house. She has her own confusion about all of this, her own guilt, her own marriage to manage, and I think she got swept into something bigger than she knew how to stop. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've forgiven everything completely. That would be a lie. And I try not to lie in this story, even when the truth makes me look less generous than I'd like. But I understand her more than I understand Marcus. That's the honest version. The rest of that Thursday evening didn't last much longer. Marcus gathered his folder, said something stiff about needing to look into a few things, and left without finishing his coffee. Denise stayed behind for a few minutes after he'd gone out to the car. She sat back down at the table, across from me, and for a while neither of us said anything. Ferris quietly excused himself to the porch, giving us the room, which I've always appreciated about him. He knows exactly when a conversation stops needing a lawyer in it. "I don't know what to say to you," Denise said eventually. "You don't have to say anything," I told her. "Not tonight." "I let it get this far," she said. "I kept telling myself he'd back off if I just gave him time. I didn't think he'd actually bring papers into your living room. I should have stopped it before it got to that." I didn't have a tidy answer for her. I still don't, if I'm honest. I told her that I loved her, that none of this changed that, and that we'd figure out the rest of it as it came. She cried a little, there at the table, the kind of crying that isn't dramatic, just quiet and tired. The crying of someone who's been holding something too heavy for too long and finally sets it down. I put my hand over hers. It was the first time either of us had touched the other in longer than I'd realized. As for Marcus, I heard, through Denise a few weeks later, that Greg Aldous had pulled his remaining investment out of the lake property entirely. Apparently Marcus had told him back in the fall that a second property was coming available soon, meaning my house, meaning me, meaning a plan that had never once included asking me what I wanted. When that plan collapsed at my kitchen table on a Thursday evening, so did whatever confidence Aldous had left in Marcus. Denise said there were a lot of phone calls after that, most of them not pleasant, and that Marcus spent a stretch of about 6 weeks looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in any of them. I don't know the full financial fallout, and I didn't ask. It wasn't my business anymore, and honestly, it wasn't my business to begin with. The debt Marcus made was his own, the same as the choice he made to sit in my living room and tell me I had no right to my own home. I never once called Aldous, never once said a word to anyone about the investment beyond what Denise volunteered. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the old man calls up the angry investor and settles the score personally, and that's not what happened. And honestly, I don't think that's the kind of man I want to be, even now. The consequences found Marcus on their own. They usually do, if you give them enough time and don't get in their way. I want to tell you what happened after, because I think that's the part people actually want to hear. And I don't think it's what you expect. Nothing dramatic happened. I didn't throw anyone out. I didn't cut Denise off. I didn't call a family meeting to announce a victory, and honestly, it never felt like a victory to me, more like narrowly avoiding a loss I hadn't seen coming. Marcus and Denise still come by sometimes, less often now, and it's different between us, quieter, more careful. The way a room feels different after you've found out it has a crack in the ceiling even after the crack's been fixed. Marcus doesn't bring up the market anymore. He barely looks at the fireplace when he's here, actually, like the mantel itself might have a memory of that Saturday evening. He did say one thing to me months later that I didn't expect. It was a small gathering, Nothing formal, just the four of us and a pot of chili I'd made from Eleanor's recipe. And at some point, out on the porch while Denise was inside doing dishes, Marcus said, "I owe you an apology I haven't given you properly." I told him he didn't have to. He said he wanted to anyway. He said the business with Aldous had knocked something loose in him, made him look at what kind of man he'd been willing to become over a spreadsheet, and that he wasn't proud of it. I appreciated him saying it. I didn't tell him it fixed everything, because it didn't, not entirely. But I told him I appreciated it, and I meant that too. I still have the house. I still sit in my chair, the one with the arm I reupholstered after the dog chewed through it back in 2004. Most evenings, usually with the local news on low, sometimes with nothing on at all. Just the sound of the refrigerator humming in the next room, and the settling noises a house makes once it's old enough to have its own kind of breathing. Ferris comes by every couple of months, has a beer, complains about his knees, tells me the same 3 stories from high school that he's told me probably 40 times. And I let him tell them anyway, because some things are worth hearing again, even when you already know how they end. The hallway closet door still doesn't sit right in its frame. I've had more than one contractor over the years offer to fix it for free, thinking they were doing me a favor. I always say no. Eleanor used to tease me about that door for 30 years, and some mornings, walking past it on the way to make coffee, I still hear her voice saying it. "Fix the door, Walter. I like the door the way it is, Eleanor." I imagine I'll be having that same argument with an empty hallway for as long as I live in that house, and I've made my peace with that. Some jokes are worth keeping even after the person who made them funny is gone. I've thought more than once about what would have happened if that clause hadn't existed. If Eleanor and I hadn't sat in Ferris's office 20 years ago, worried about a diagnosis that turned out fine, and made a decision neither of us fully understood at the time beyond the basic shape of "this protects us." It's strange to think that something so quiet, so buried, so easily forgotten, ended up being the thing that mattered most. We didn't do it because we were clever. We did it because Ferris was thorough and because Eleanor, God rest her, always did believe in reading the fine print on things other people skip past. I didn't build that house to prove anything to anybody. I built it so there'd always be a door that opened when I knocked. And I suppose without ever meaning to, I made sure of something else too, that nobody else could close that door on me, even 20 years before I knew I'd need to remember that. I told this whole story to the fellows at Tuesday Coffee, eventually. The retired drivers I mentioned earlier. Men who've known me longer than Marcus has been alive, some of them. One of them, a man named Curtis who drove for a different outfit for almost as many years as I drove for mine, listened to the whole thing without saying a word, which isn't like him because Curtis has an opinion about nearly everything. When I finished, he just shook his head slowly and said, 20 years, Walter. You carried that paper for 20 years and never even knew you were carrying it." I told him I suppose that was true. He said, "That's the thing about the things that matter most. Half the time you don't even feel the weight of them until the day you need them to hold you up." I've thought about that more than once since. How much of what protects us in this life was decided years before we ever needed the protection, by a version of ourselves or people who loved us, who couldn't have known exactly what they were guarding against, only that guarding against something, anything, seemed like the responsible thing to do at the time. Eleanor and I weren't trying to outsmart anybody 20 years ago. We were just trying to survive a scare with her thyroid and keep our small life together in one piece. Neither of us could have imagined a spreadsheet, a lake house, a man named Greg Aldous, or a Saturday evening decades later when all of it would come due at once in my own living room over a leather folder full of brochures. I don't say any of this to make Marcus sound worse than he already has in this story, or to make myself sound wiser than I was. I was scared that Saturday night, same as anybody would be. I didn't have some clever plan sitting in my back pocket, waiting to be sprung at the right dramatic moment. I just had an old piece of paper I'd almost forgotten about, drawn up by a friend who takes his work seriously, signed by 2 people who loved each other and were trying, however clumsily, to protect the only real thing they'd built together. People sometimes ask me if I regret how quiet the ending was. No big confrontation, No dramatic scene where I finally tell Marcus exactly what I think of him. Nothing you'd call satisfying in the way movies make these things satisfying. I don't regret it. I think there's a version of me, a younger version maybe, or just an angrier one, who would have wanted that scene, who would have wanted to stand in that kitchen and make Marcus feel exactly as small as he'd tried to make me feel. But I've buried a wife. I've built a house board by board with my own two hands. I've driven a truck through blizzards that would make most men pull over and wait it out, because sometimes the job is just to keep going steady when everything around you is telling you to panic. Somewhere along the way, I think I learned that the loudest response isn't usually the strongest one. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is just stay standing in the house you built and let the truth do the rest of the work for you. These days, when Denise and Marcus come by, we mostly talk about ordinary things. The chili recipe, Curtis's latest complaint about his knees, which I relay secondhand because Marcus, oddly, has started asking about the old drivers like he genuinely wants to know how we're all doing. Sometimes we don't talk about anything important at all, and I've come to think that's its own kind of grace. The ability to sit in a room together again without either of us needing the conversation to mean something. I still knock on that hallway closet door sometimes, out of habit, the way you'd knock on wood for luck. It still doesn't sit right in its frame. It probably never will, not while I'm the one living here. And every single time, for just a second, I hear Eleanor telling me to fix it, and I tell her, the same as always, that I like the door the way it is. That's the whole story. Make of it what you will.